All right. Well, we have 12:01 here. I'm so thrilled about this conversation. So other people will just miss our boring housekeeping notes at the beginning. I think we'll get started. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so thrilled to see some familiar faces and some new faces who are here for their first ever collaborative conversation. And for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, my name is Sue Chan-Carasoni, and I'm the Managing Director of the McMaster Collaborative for Health and Aging. And I'm excited to be hosting this collaborative conversation today. And in the audience, we have those who lead with their clinical research or health research lens, those with social science backgrounds, and those leading with their lived experience of aging and health. And I expect this presentation will be a catalyst for new conversations and ideas for all of us. And while we are gathering today on Zoom, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which McMaster is built and where I'm signed in from today are the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And we acknowledge the importance of the land, which we call home, in part to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve relationships between nations and to improve our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. And I take this moment, as I did when I was preparing for this morning, and I invite you to join me to remind ourselves of our commitment to equity and fairness in our work and beyond. And improving fairness includes acknowledging and addressing the structural barriers and inequities which continue to exist, in part due to the colonial history in Canada. And on that note, I'm excited to welcome our special guest presenters, Doctors Paula Gardner, Kim Sawchuk, and Alpha Abebe. They'll introduce themselves in a few moments, but you can also read more about them in today's event description, which is on our website. And in this series, we bring together researchers and people with lived experiences to share their journeys and lessons learned in patient-oriented research or research done in partnership with individuals and communities. And today's session, Dr. Paula Gardner and her colleagues will discuss ways in which they have conducted collaborative research with diverse community populations using critical feminist, anti-colonial, and disability-centered approaches. So just a few housekeeping notes. The webinar portion of this event is being recorded, and it'll be shared with you and posted with our past conversations on our website. So please feel free to disable your video if you don't want to be recorded on camera. And we will stop the recording before a reflecting together time that begins at 1 p.m. Questions and conversations are welcome and encouraged at the end of the formal presentation, but please feel free to use the chat function if that works for you throughout the conversation as things emerge or resonate with you. The live transcription and closed captioning has been enabled, and so you can turn this on or off for yourself individually using those three dots or the more button. And lastly, you're invited to join the Reflecting Together, which is an opportunity for all of us as trainees, collaborative partners, and community members to come together and share your thoughts on the topics discussed. And hopefully this will be our opportunity to let those sparks and ideas grow and develop. And this portion of the discussion will be from 1 to 1:30 in the same Zoom space, so you just stay on if you're interested. And that part will be facilitated by Tina and Mike, who are two of the collaborative's older adult partners. So for those of you who are new or newer to the collaborative, I just have one quick slide, well, two maybe, primarily to encourage you to follow up and learn more about what we do at the McMaster Collaborative for Health and Aging. We're a coalition of researchers, trainees, older adults, and caregivers working together to improve the health and well-being of older Canadians by advancing patient-oriented research on aging. And we aim to achieve this by providing research and engagement consultations and support, promoting training and mentorship, and facilitating partnerships and knowledge translation for patient-oriented research on aging, such as the series of collaborative conversations that we're here for today. So you can connect with us through email, Twitter, YouTube, or LinkedIn. You can also find, as I mentioned, the past collaborative conversations on our YouTube channel. On our website is where you can find some of the resources and sign up for our newsletter and announcements for future collaborative conversations. And so just a quick plug, our next one and last one before we take a summer break will be on June 7th. And this one will be on assessing the scalability of the ACRU CPP, an intervention for older adults with diabetes and multiple chronic conditions. So we're not reflecting together yet until we have the meat of our presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Paula. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Sue. And I really want to thank the collaborative for this lovely invitation to invite me and some of my colleagues to come and talk about our research, some of the principles and values that inform our research, and really, I think, talk practically about how we've learned to do this research and continue to learn to do this research. It's an ongoing process. So first, let me introduce my colleagues who are joining me here, and then I'll talk for about 15 or 20 minutes. So Dr. Alpha Abebe is here. Alpha is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Humanities, recently situated with us in Communication Studies and Media Arts, which is a great gift to us. Alpha teaches courses in leadership, equity, diversity, and accessibility and inclusion practices in our everyday lives, in business, in educational structures for our students at McMaster. She is the co-lead of the African Diasporic Studies program here at McMaster, and is
Paula's on.
Paula, I can't hear you. Your volume is down. Just 1 second, guys, while we get this sorted out. Perhaps, Paula, did you want to try logging out and rejoining? See if that makes a difference.
Is that okay now?
There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. You know what? It's Bluetooth headphones.
It happens.
Got out on you. Okay. So Alpha is very involved in a range of community-based practices and engagements in the Hamilton and Toronto region, and Alpha is going to talk about some of those approaches and some of those projects. My colleague, Kim Sawchuk, I've been working with Kim collaboratively for about 20 years in a range of arts-based and community-based practices with mobile and other kinds of technologies. Kim is professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia. She runs the ACT Lab and Research Project, which was formerly a research project that won a partnership grant with SSHRC, an enormous grant, to study aging and communication technology. So she'll be talking about some of those projects and her deep collaboration with community-based groups. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got some visuals for us. And can you see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I thought I'd begin with the idea of thinking about the term that I put in the title of this talk, which is extraction. And I think we hear this word bandied about quite a bit in theory, but what does it really mean? And practically, we might get this kind of image about mineral extraction, taking from the land, scarring the land, injuring the land in irreparable sorts of ways and not giving back. And this is the idea I think about when I'm thinking about how to not do extractive research in my practice with communities. Non-extractive research is one that thinks about what we're leaving behind, how we can sustain communities, build communities, bring in lots of different voices, especially unheard voices, and build things that the community needs. So it involves values of recognition, listening, respect, consultation, and deep integration. And these things are easier said than done. In my research, I am a communication studies and media practitioner, media arts practitioner. So I come from a range of influences that are theoretical, applied, and practical. And the practical I've learned through work with a range of colleagues in academic networks, but also largely through participatory work with communities. And I'm going to talk about some of that. But I wanted to just start with a bit of recognition of the types of approaches that we do draw on in my work with Pulse Lab and with my collaborative groups. So one is feminist approaches. And feminist approaches that we use in this work are deeply linked to critical race studies approaches, post-colonial approaches, approaches that we fondly term third world feminism because they're reflecting the lived experience and strategies of women of color who have written about how to engage with the world in equitable ways and demand recognition, voice, and work to challenge domination and oppressions. So we draw from a range of approaches in this world, and increasingly we're integrating these kinds of feminist third world approaches in our media practice approaches, our art approaches, and in the world of cybernetic feminism, where we think about feminism, technology, and equity and diversity. We think about how to bring in local voices, how to garner those hard lessons of folks who have always lived on the margins and battled intersectional kinds of tensions and pressures. Situated approaches, which means bringing in learnings from lived experience and thinking about the intersections of various practices of bias, how experiences of gender plus race plus class, for example, can create accumulating and exponential kinds of biases that are really difficult to surmount. So we have to think carefully about methods through which we do that. With regard to technology, we also think about how the technologies we build are embedded with certain kinds of affordances, such as tracking and surveillance, but even practices of prediction that can put people at risk who are not considered dominant, normative members of society. So we think a lot about this in our methods of practice with communities, but also in what we're making with communities. And Kim will talk about thinking about how those practices in turn inform aging, identity, agency. Our work is also informed by Indigenous feminist approaches, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of that work on the next slide. But an Indigenous feminist approach links environmental, racial, and gender justice. So how those kinds of extractive processes on environments are based on race or gender can create inequities, and how those are all kind of a system of domination that we need to think about as linked. And then a CRIP and disability approach. And I'll say I have a son with medical disabilities and learning disabilities. And so this has been a part of my everyday life and experience for a long time. And I also work with folks in my lab who have this lived experience and this theoretical disposition. And those kinds of practices are deeply linked to the critical aging research that I think Kim and Alpha will be talking about. And so that approach rejects the idea of the normal body, the normal brain, normal ways of aging, healthism, the idea that a medicalized version of health is the ideal, rejects the idea that anyone needs to be cured or repaired or recovered, and kind of pushes back with thinking about how individuals who see themselves as disabled celebrate life, thrive in life via all kinds of practices. So that's a brief introduction, and I'm not going to talk a lot about theory here. I'm really going to talk about how to apply theory. So I wanted to share with you one of these researchers, and this is Dr. Kim Tallbear. She holds a Tier 1 research chair at the University of Alberta and has written on many things, including what an Indigenous feminist approach to research is. And she talks about the problem of research that seeks to give back. And other feminist researchers talk about this in the guise of problematizing the idea of care, that care can be an imposition if people aren't asking for it, but we're giving it to them. And I think this is a similar idea that Kim Tallbear is thinking about here. If we're giving back to communities and speaking on behalf of communities, this is determining their goals and taking away their power and agency. So we really have to resist this kind of liberalist notion that giving and caring is in and of itself a good thing. Those kinds of practices can exploit participants, retract, take rewards for ourselves, not give back to communities. And these practices, instead of repairing inequities and practices of domination, actually reinforce them. And one of the biggest problems is that kind of research often devalues community knowledge and instead values our disciplinary knowledges, particularly of experts who are academics or health experts. And so here is an article by Kim Tallbear, who talks about an approach to non-extractive research based on faithful knowledge. So co-constituting knowledges together. Turn the lens, there's a typo there. Turn the lens, instead of the lens on the community, turn the lens back on the researchers and how we're conducting ourselves, creating goals and objectives. Share conceptual ground and stakes with stakeholders. Think together on what our goals are, and they might be different, but putting them all on the table is crucial to creating a research program that works for everyone involved. And think expansively around risks and rightful benefits as we create knowledge together. So that's an excellent aspirational lens, I think, to begin our conversation today. So I'm going to talk a bit about my experience. So I spent 12 years at OCAD University working collaboratively and with community in the Mobile Experience Lab. I now do that in Pulse Lab, which I direct here at McMaster. I've been a long-term founding member of FemTechNet, which is a network of collaborative feminist cybernetic researchers working with community, and especially in community-based educational programs, to think about how to integrate critical collaboration practices into our work as a network and our work as educators, co-educators in higher education and community-based settings. And then I've got two projects here I'm going to talk about, which are the Affect and Able project. All of these projects have helped me to continue to learn about how to interject these values and principles, not just in our methods of collaboration, but in the things we're making, and think again about their outcomes. So I'm a big fan of taking big theoretical ideas and digesting them into blueprints. I think a lot of the research we produce as academics does not do this. My graduate students are continually telling me, that's a great article and it's aspirational, but I still don't know if I'm doing this right. What does this look like when you do it right? So here are some key how-tos that I have pulled from my training on the ground with community groups, my training from community-based groups who have actually given us workshops in anti-oppression training and equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility training that I've had through the university, through our really fabulous equity diversity unit here at McMaster, and again, through my training with groups. So be curious. Curiosity helps us to really listen to people we're working with in community. Don't be defensive, right? It's not about bringing attention back on ourselves for how we feel about the process, but really getting on with the work and learning to do things better. Learn, listen well, listen better, listen intentionally. We can all be better listeners. doubt habits we have in research, because habits tend to house hidden practices of oppression. When you're working with a team, build community, build relationships, because it gives you the grounding for the hard work that's going to happen in collaboration. Exchange knowledge and really use techniques for exchanging knowledge. So offer opportunities for community groups to teach us, to give us workshops. Tell stories. When we tell stories, we explain ourselves and our lived experience in deep ways. Have fun in our work together. Iterate, iterate, iterate. Do it, break it, do it again. I'm going to talk a bit about what that means. Bring in more voices and disciplines. And so one of the backgrounds of what I'm talking about here is how interdisciplinary practices inform this critical community-based work. And an overarching goal of this work is to continue to find ways to create research practices that diverse community groups want to participate in and feel safe participating in, because it makes our research better. It enriches all of the data we collect. So our research reflects the worlds we live in. It's crucial. Reflect, but also assess, create assessment tools for figuring out what we did right and what we can learn from. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples from research that I've been involved in for how we've integrated some of those values, principles, and practices and techniques. So this is a project I'll note briefly. This is a project that I did in 2016. It's with a youth group, but I think that these kinds of principles run across age groups that we work with. And so I'm going to bring in this project. This was a project where we had a grant and we had an idea of creating a migration storytelling platform. So digital storytelling that was participatory, that communities could contribute to help share stories, build empathy, strategies for thriving wherever immigrants are landing. And we created a relationship with an immigrant and refugee group in Toronto with a lot of precarious immigrants and youth. And we created a relationship with them and invited them to co-create the project with us. So one of the techniques that we used there and that we continue to use is to bring a blueprint to the group. Instead of asking them, what would you like to do in terms of storytelling, which is a really vague question and hard to ideate and create around. And so we bring a prototype. So we brought this kind of prototype, like this is what a mapping project could look like. And this could potentially be how it gets used. And as we got feedback from them, we iterated and redesigned and completely broke the project. At the end, the youth involved didn't want to do this because as we used creative techniques to play and imagine what this mapping could look like, what they really wanted to do was to create a game to help incoming youth, particularly who were precarious or undocumented, to understand their feelings, name their feelings, and strategize about how to survive in an environment like Toronto, where they feel housing insecurity, economic insecurity, and security just walking down the street, fearful that a police officer might stop them and find out that their family's undocumented. And so here and then in the bottom right corner, so in the top right, you see some of the cards that we started designing with them. And then in the bottom right, the next stage, which is creating it so that it's customizable and has the trace of the hand of the artist maker who wants to make a particular kind of deck. The reason I give this to you is because it's an example of what breaking looks like, because we talk about disruptive design and breaking, but this is what that means for us, is presenting a project and saying, you can really destroy this. You can make a different goal for the game, have different objectives. It can take a different format. It's not a map, it's a game. And they completely broke it. And that process where we broke with them allowed them to really trust us and take ownership of this project. So that's one of my examples of breaking. All right, I'm going to pivot now to one of our aging projects. We've been working on this at McMaster with money from McMaster Institute for Research on Aging and some other funders that I note at the end of this talk. ABLE is, as you can see, art-based therapies or technologies to encourage longevity in elders or elderly participants. And it has taken many, many iterations. I don't have time to talk about them all. With the pandemic, we pivoted from an interactive game interface to a web-based game interface. And some of the objectives of this project are to rigorously co-design with older adults. 2, to create a hospitable, easy to use, highly accessible online environment for co-located interaction. So that means I'm in my house, they're in their house or somewhere else. We can be multiple groups in multiple houses, but we can enter this interface together and make art together, play together, or socialize together. You might imagine that during the pandemic, this became more of an imperative to us. And I'm going to give you a few examples here of how we used particular techniques in the design process to create this interface as highly accessible. So it's informed by dementia-informed practices and critical aging practices. But when we design that way, it means sort of everyone can use it, right? It's highly accessible. We're thinking broadly about universal design. Here are some of our partners. We increasingly are trying to work with partners who represent diverse communities in Hamilton and Toronto. And we've got an incoming grant that Kim and I have just won that we cannot announce yet, but we're going to be working with a lot of other community partners across Canada, and they're listed on the bottom. Stay tuned for that announcement. So what does it mean to co-design with older adults? What are the principles and practices here? Think about safety and consent. We have positioned community partners as envoys so that community participants have a trusted community group to talk to about the research engagement and share concerns or desires that they might not feel comfortable sharing immediately with researchers. Think about your envoys. If your envoys are family or caregivers, we all know that family and caregivers have a large degree of burnout. So really think in the research process about labor and how that might be helping or harming those envoys. Our meeting approach to older adults, especially our older adults with dementia, who we worked with a lot on this project, but all older adults, is to make sure that the meeting is structured in predictable ways that are not anxiety producing, that are casual, have different ways of participating, and that we keep redesigning those methods to respond to the needs of the older adults. The older adults are experts. We assume we don't know much of anything about what we should be doing, and that really creates a humility that invites a lot of participation and great ideas from the older adults. Older adults drive every piece of the research, what we're trying to do, our goals, the kinds of game and art interventions they're interested in, and what the interface looks like. Here is the interface. It's meant to be sparse. We use a number of techniques. You might notice the pencil and the eraser icon. That's skeuomorphic design. That means that instead of using an abstract image, the image looks like the thing. So the eraser looks like an eraser. There are options for customizing using colors that you like. There's an embedded, where you see the P, that's an embedded video interface so that we can play right here on one interface and we don't need to bring in Zoom. So there are a lot, we are also using shadowing so that the two-dimensional boxes that are shadowed are actually pressable. Those are buttons. So that's signaling in a way that makes sense for the way we all think. We've all come to think through technology. Here are a few examples of some of of the games that you can play in a co-located way. I'll share the website with you later. We don't have time to go there. We also have an onboarding feature that I didn't talk about, but this is sort of like when you open and start your Apple device, it walks you through a few steps to get your new computer working. This is what we do here. And that was in direct response to feedback that people got to this game site here and didn't know how to play. All right, I'm going to wrap in just a few minutes and hand it over to my colleagues. Very quickly, effect.ca is a feminist technology project where we were trying to solve a problem of why diverse folks do not feel invited or supported in careers or educational spaces where we work with technology and media. And what we did was we worked extremely collaboratively with MetTrack, Atwater, and the Sexual Assault Resource Center. All of these groups have deep experience in anti-oppressive, anti-colonial approaches to addressing the core barriers to entry into higher education and social organizations that pivot on issues that pivot on identity, that really hold back, prohibit women, particularly women of color, women from different sexual and gender communities. And so we started from the ground up and we devised a method for creating curriculum that teaches digital literacy, digital safety, and media creation. But the curriculum is deeply informed by feminist and anti-colonial approaches. It's an online book, it's open access, it's at that website, effect.ca, it's free. And the reason I'm telling you about this is because, again, this work was created with deep collaboration. It took us an extra year because we spent the first year sharing knowledge, giving each other workshops in digital safety, digital literacy, anti-oppressive practices. And only after a year did we have enough trust and community built that we could build this book. We all collaborated on chapters. MetTrack staff and youth educators contributed to this book. And we feel like it was a really great learning experience for all of us. The last thing I'll say is there are some techniques we drew from this. And in the second chapter, or in this chapter here, Cultivating Connections, you'll find a lesson in how to create community agreements. So at the very beginning of a research project, everyone in the room talks about what they need to participate fully. And then we created techniques for pausing and talking through issues when there were sort of violations of that agreement. And so this is another technique I give to you that's a practical technique that makes people feel safe and to be able to bring their whole self to the group. I'll talk about this if we have time, but I want to hand this over to my colleagues. So why do we do this? What are the stakes? What are the benefits? Obviously, empowerment, respect, and reparation. We have caused harm with traditional forms of research that's focused on, that's focused on white supremacy and sort of a colonial approach to extracting what we need for ourselves without consideration of community. We learn, we grow. Together, we make projects and knowledges that we cannot make on our own. This work is more creative and sustainable and inclusive. And I guess the two most important things I want to say is that this models how to for our students, for our collaborators. It models for communities, for government structures and community arts and health and recreational organizations to revise methods, and it destabilizes all of the practices that prop up our structures that are based on domination and exclusion. And so here I would like to thank the funders, and I'm going to stop my share and hand it over to my next contributor, and that is going to be Alpha.
Thank you, Paula. That was my first time hearing the presentation, so I also learned a lot, and I think there's a lot of nice continuity with some of the things that I'll be touching on. So thank you for the invitation to join. I am going to also share my screen. So when Paula invited me to graciously invited me to join in on this conversation, I was thinking about you know, just going through the various experiences that I've had on various ends of participatory research initiatives and experience and processes, both as a participant as well as a researcher. And so I thought it would be worth reflecting on some of the things that come to mind, some of these, what I'm describing here as, you know, critical incidents, not necessarily catastrophic incidents, but things that have stayed with me, that have shaped my thinking and my approach to participatory processes and participatory research, and also some things that haunt me. And I think haunt me in what I would say is a good way. I think there are some things, as Paula said, there's an ugly history that precedes us when it comes to research. And so I think we should be haunted by those things, even if we ourselves have not been, we're not the ones doing it, you know, we are implicated in, and I think it's important that that's part of, you know, our process as researchers. So I'll be talking about this place as a dwelling place of ethical in-betweenness, and just really talking quite informally about some of my own experiences that have prompted some reflections on this. This image is one that I share with most of my students, and I do teach quite a few inquiry and research methods courses, and even those that are not formally you know, focused on methods or inquiry. I usually have a module at the beginning of my course when I talk to students about reflexivity, because I think it's something that's important in all the work that we do as researchers, as students, and as community members. And so this is somewhat creepy image, but I thought I would start, you know, here. And it's just this reminder that in the work that we are doing, as Paula said, that it needs to be iterative, this process of reflecting inward and turning the lens back on ourselves, and using that to inform the way that we are, you know, engaging with and thinking about and writing about and researching about other people and other communities. And vice versa, that as we are out there in the quote unquote field, learning from and with others, that we are using that information and those insights and embodied knowledges to shape the way that we see ourselves as individuals, as actors, as researchers. I did want to start with this quote. I promise it's the only slide I have that's this dense, but I think it's a helpful way to frame the conversation, and at least in part of what I'm thinking about today out loud. And this is a quote taken from the afterword of a book called Unraveling Research. And this chapter by Rezek, I appreciate the nuance and the honesty here. And the author here is talking about this state of in-betweenness that I've sort of chosen as an anchor for our conversation. So I will just read it and you can read it along with me. So it says here, researchers are by definition in a state of in-betweenness. As critical as we are of the colonial structures in which we find ourselves, it is hard to leave our positions of scholarly authority and the material benefits of our scholarly perch, even when we occupy precarious positions in the academy. Many of the people we interact with for our research know well the contradictions with which we live. It puts us on the defensive, and this speaks a little bit to some of what Paula was talking about, this impulse that sometimes we have to be defensive. It puts us on the defensive. We call ourselves activist scholars, scholars for social justice, allies of the oppressed, and often insist that we are insiders to the communities we study for one reason or another, sharing a race, a gender, a class, a history of oppression, solidarity, or sisterhood. Yet, our structural in-betweenness also generates a deep commitment to being critically reflexive. We are committed to navigating what we already know to be a trap, unwilling to believe that we are, as Malcolm X insisted, either part of the problem or the solution. Instead, we embrace this in-betweenness where things can feel temporarily ethical, even as we never stop worrying that there is no pure ethical dwelling place. So I really feel like this is there's some provocative thoughts here. I appreciate this framing of ethical in-betweenness, this call to an honesty about what's actually possible. And so I'll come back to some of these thoughts when I come back to reflect on some concluding thoughts, but I thought I'd share that up front. And so I'll enter into some story time. As I said, I've picked out 4 different just reflections from my experiences in participatory research processes, and just talk through some things that I learned. So as mentioned, so myself, I was born and raised in Toronto to Ethiopian parents, grew up doing a lot of youth advocacy work, doing a lot of grassroots work in various ethnocultural communities and Black communities. And so just by nature of the communities I grew up in, the issues I was interested in, and my own lived experiences and experience of my community, I actually had some very early experiences as a participant and collaborator in participatory research. And actually that's where I caught the bug as far as research is concerned, and shaped my trajectory. And so the one incident I wanted to talk about was my very first and very early experience doing participatory action research. And so I was part of a what came together as a group of youth researchers. I was the sort of the research principal investigator, if you want to call it that, of our little youth research team. And we were engaged by a very large international organization that was doing community-based participatory action research projects looking at various ethnocultural communities. And they were interested in supporting us, in giving us some funding, and providing a platform for us to do some youth-led work on issues in our community that fed into a larger initiative. So I can unpack some of the details if it's of interest later on, but what I wanted to point to was what happened at the end of this process. So it all happened very quickly. It was a great experience, learning experience. It wasn't perfect, but I think we were able to do a lot. We were able to capture the perspectives of, this early in the formation of the Ethiopian community in Toronto. So there really was very little work that had been done on the community, and very few platforms for the community to share its perspectives, particularly youth perspectives. So the work was really important. And in our conversations, we did, peer-led interviews and focus groups. There was a sense of urgency that really came from the community, right? That they were more than ready to share their perspectives, and also were looking to us as one of the first people asking for their perspectives to act on what they were sharing, right? And act on some of the recommendations that were coming through. And that was the premise of the larger project. It was supposed to be an action research project. And so when we fast forwarded to the end and we finished, we wrapped up, we did a nice, polished report, as we always do. And we had this very fancy high-level forum where we presented the research, and I was the one presenting on behalf of the team. And I'm struck, I can still picture myself there. I think I probably was like 19 at the time, and very eager, and was in a room full of very powerful people with lots of resources, and sharing the insights from this report. There was just something about the faces when I looked out. There was nothing negative happened, but I just looked out and I thought, these are not the people who are going to be acting on this report. The action is not going to be. There was a little bit of a patronizing and quality to the way in which this was received. People were proud of us, patted us on the back, but you could just tell. And so it's partly critique, but I will say that realization for us actually lit a fire under us, and so we decided we were not going to wait for anybody else, that we were actually going to act ourselves. And so lots of beautiful things happened at the community level as the result of this work. So I think it was a win in the end. But it made the reflection question that comes out of this for me is that I'm asking all of us to think about, now and continuously, when we're engaging in projects like this is who will and who should actually take meaningful action at the end of participatory processes. I think, just because we call it, and this is something that people have, talked about quite a bit in the literature and in the community, because we call it an action research project and have good intentions, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to materialize. And I think we have to reckon with, where that action really is happening and where it should be happening. So that's one story. The second I wanted to share comes also from a similar time in my life, a little bit later down the road. I had a bit more research under my belt and was part of a collective of youth organizations that were doing various bits of work around youth advocacy across the city. And so we were approached by a government agency. I will pause to say that the reason why we were approached is that there was something that happened, there was a political impulse, something that happened in the news that caused a bit of a moral panic around, some youth violence related issues. And so there was a flurry of activity, as we often see, to do something about it, to do more research, to create some action. And so we were approached, and with again the promise of resources and a platform to do some community-based research on the issue. And we actually, our first reaction was and response was no. And so, we looked at it, we thought about it, we said, okay, we have questions about the impulse to begin with. We've also been down this road before several times, with various researchers and government agencies. Many of the communities that are represented in our collective have done research, have reports, have said what they needed to say about this issue. And that ethically, we did not feel comfortable going back to our communities and asking them to relive these stories yet again, when we haven't actually taken meaningful action from the last time that they talked to us. And so we said, no, thank you. And I think the reality is that this initiative, they needed the youth voice to be legitimate, right? For this project to be legitimate, they needed us to participate. That became quite clear. And so it ended up being a long, extended negotiation process, where they were trying to convince us to participate. In the end, where we landed, we decided that we would participate under the conditions that we were actually not going to collect any more data, that we were going to repackage what we already had and share it again. And so that's what we did. And, I think it was a useful piece of work. But again, I think of that, and I share the story also with my students when we talk about, research ethics. I think about, especially in the moment that we're in right now, this intoxicating addiction to data that we have, this idea that we need more data. And even as very well-meaning practitioners and researchers who want to see action on issues, often it's, okay, well, if we can just get more data, then something will change, then they will be convinced, then, And so the question for me that comes out of this is, do we actually need more data on this issue, right? Like, is that true? Do we actually need more data, or does that data already exist somewhere? And if we do want more data for whatever reason, are we, really thinking through what the cost is to the community? And so this really comes back to some of, Paula's earlier reflections around the history of extractive research, and our Indigenous colleagues and leaders and elders have really, I think, led the way in helping us think through some of the, ethical concerns with extractive and practices and re-traumatizing that happens when we just go back to communities over and over again. And so I've been very inspired by things like the OCAP principles. There's a Jane and Finch in Toronto, there's a Jane and Finch Research Collective that also has their own set of principles where communities are beginning to push back and say, we are no longer just rolling with the punches, that we have our own terms of engagement, and sometimes the answer is going to be no. So that's the next story. And then the third of four stories, is connected to the guarantees sometimes that we offer, or maybe believe ourselves about the importance and the impact that our work will have. And this comes from some community-based work that I did as a professional. And so this was a very large project, and we were going to various communities across Ontario, engaging them and making a pitch for them to participate in this initiative. And with the promise, this was a health policy and health equity related project, with the promise that we were using this, that the entire impulse for the project was to drive policy change on some of these issues. And we were going to Indigenous communities as well. And I will say that that absolutely was the intention, and the project was set up to do that. And actually the people who were behind this project were very, very suspicious of research for the sake of research's sake. So that, and certainly that was the orientation that I came to this work from as well. And so that was the promise. And, we met with, there was a lot of resistance that we were met with out in the community. The people that we were connecting with had, again, been down this road before, and were not always jumping at the opportunity to participate in yet another research project. But, we made the case. And so we were able to do some really great research on these issues. Now, as the project culminated and we were, wrapping everything up and just about to get geared up for the phase 2 of the work, which was going to be that policy engagement and policy impact, there was an unnamed, I won't name names, but there was a change in government that just absolutely changed the nature of the kind of policy work that was possible. And there were a lot of doors that were closed to us. And so by no fault of the team itself, we just were not able to do the kind of work and have the kind of impact that we wanted to. And then since then, I left the organization. We all kind of went about our lives, but this was something that really haunted me, because I remember distinctly having conversations with people saying, no, I promise we're not like the other guys. We're for real this time. This one's gonna, have an impact. And so that, again, has had me really thinking about what we can guarantee and what we promise. One thing I will say about this project that makes me feel a little bit at peace was that, oh, now my AirPods died. Can you still hear me? You can still hear me? Okay. Was that part of what we did in the design of the project was develop local community reports and outputs that the community could use in their own work, so that they were not relying upon us to use the work to inform their efforts. So that gives me some peace. And then finally, this is something that's prompted by some work I'm doing right now. So I'm engaged right now in some work that's looking at Black community engagement in health policy processes. And sorry, I'm just reading the chat. And so this, when we began this work, there was this common what became sort of what has really emerged as an understanding that Black communities are not adequately represented in formal public engagement processes as it relates to health policy and policy more generally. And so I was interested in this, in doing some work around this, but I really paused to think about where we were at in this work, and recognizing that despite the goal and intentions, if I were to approach this with that as the problem, right, and looking at that as a side of the problem, the representation, that we were at risk of reproducing the same narrative, right, that the problem was the community, that the problem was these Black communities that needed to be better engaged, that somehow just needed, with the sort of deficit framing. And so what we decided to do was to kind of flip the script and instead look at the community itself and what they were doing to engage policymakers, or to, including some of the advocacy work that doesn't always get captured as public and policy engagement. And so to kind of shift our gaze to where the community action was. And that really fundamentally changed, I think, the conversation. We learned a lot that we probably wouldn't learn otherwise. And so the reflection question coming from that is sometimes the necessity to kind of go back to the drawing board and to ask ourselves, what questions are we asking, in our work, and are we inadvertently reproducing, deficit or pathological framings just because of that, our starting points? And so I'll just end with these concluding thoughts that I'm happy to pick up on in conversation. One is that I've posed these reflection questions, but there are no easy answers to them. But I do still think that we need to reckon with them and continue to ask ourselves these questions. I also believe personally that this question, should we be doing this work at all, is a legitimate and important question to ask ourselves. And sometimes maybe the answer is no, which is a hard pill to swallow for researchers, I know, myself included. That we need a radical level of honesty with ourselves and the communities we engage, and a healthy dose of humility. I appreciated Paula's point there around humility about the reach and impact of our work. That as long as we occupy researcher positions, we should acknowledge and accept the space of ethical in-betweenness that we dwell in, rather than aiming for this elusive ethical purity. And that, in my view, meaningful action happens by and with communities. And so what we should be asking ourselves is, how can we equip, amplify, and partner in this work, or get out of the way? And I will end it there. Thank you.
Thanks. And we've been so enthusiastic and overshot our slides, and we're almost at time. I'm wondering, can we push a bit into the hour and just have Kim Sawchuk share her really important work on aging and technology?
I can do it in 5 minutes.
Oh, Kim, you're amazing.
So let me just start quickly, and I'll just, Alpha, that was fantastic. Paula, thank you so much. I'll try and share my screen now. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, that's great.
Flipping the question?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to really try and go through this quickly. Thank you very much for having me here. My name is Kim Sawchuk, and I'm from the ACT Lab. I come from a tradition called research creation, which for me basically thinks about new methods that allow us to tell new stories, and stories in different ways from a variety of perspectives. I'll just put this on, sorry, on my timer. I'm not going to go through this because we don't have time. One of the things I'm going to say is we have a number of projects we've done trying to use the kind of methodological both principles and values that both Alpha and Paula have outlined. And we're right now, and I'm actually sitting in an escape room on older adult mistreatment that has been co-developed with community organizations who work on older adult mistreatment with different cultural communities in Montreal, linguistic communities and racialized communities. This is what it looked like when we presented in 2019, and this is actually what it looks like now. And we're launching this in collaboration with our community partners to try and make younger. And when we did pilot projects, we realized it wasn't the older adults who needed to know about this. It was how to communicate this to policymakers and younger people, and also health professionals, but also understand what does it mean to be a witness and a bystander, so that you can actually be working with someone else to help them to make decisions about what to do next in their lives. We've done podcasting with older adults. We've tried to make policy interventions using multimedia, bringing older adults into the process by showing them governmental websites, having them navigate it, showing how ridiculous it is and how much participation can create the illusion of inclusion, even though the language might sound fantastic, and then editing it with them and then putting it online or taking it to Ottawa and forcing people to listen to it. And sometimes they listen, but mostly they don't, but we go on. I would like to say that being a feminist and doing work from a decolonial perspective that is trying to deal with these kind of ethical principles is sometimes like doing the dishes. It just never ends. There's always another pile. We've done projects on memory with the Atwater Library that I don't want to go into this, but it was a great lesson in thinking about how the format of where you present has to be also the part of the collaborative process, not just the making with others, not just the providing people with skills, not just giving them a creative outlet, but thinking sometimes what are the ways they also want to have what it is they make together put into a public forum. We have done flash mobs with a group that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, and who I just ran from because we have a choir and we're doing an event June 15 for World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, where we will be knitting, but also presenting a letter to our provincial minister about the lack of change that's happening in terms of making changes in long-term care in Quebec. I hear Alpha's point about, do we need more data? That's one of the points the community organizations are saying. We actually don't need more data. We just need you to listen to all the, read your own reports and look at the data that has already been done, and maybe actually think that academics working with communities have something to say. We have done work against the imposition of the Charter Bill 60, which was using the guise of religious freedom to actually create more difficulty for community organizations from racialized groups to be able to operate in Quebec. We've done projects again at the co-designed and filmed with our groups that also included a Bollywood dance number that they worked on for quite a long time. That was called Madhu Sari, and that's Madhu with the bindi, with the gray hair, where she told the story of her work as a social worker and a care worker in a hospital and a nurse through all her saris. And that was her choice for storytelling. We've done work on the politics of food with Reka. And again, one of the things that's interesting, this may all look really wonderful, but one of the reasons we end up doing all these darn projects that are fantastic, maybe, is because the government many years ago got rid of core funding for community organizations. And what that meant under the Harper government, which has never been reinstituted, is that you're always applying for grants and you can never go back to your core mandate. And you always have to be innovating and finding new wonderful things to sort of do the things that you think are worthwhile for and with your communities over and over and over and over again. We can talk about that later. We're now starting at my university. I'm trying to designate a plot of land as a living lab for empowered aging because we had a garden and we grew 4,000 pounds of vegetables last year that we worked with a community organization called New Hope for Seniors because groceries are really expensive. 40% of seniors living in NDG, which people think is a wealthy neighborhood, is not and suffer food insecurity. So we are trying to expand the garden project and invite researchers in who may want to do work on health or other areas. My 10 minutes is up. Give me 30 more seconds to pitch projects to us, but to use the garden as a site for engagement of all kinds. And not only because it's good and healthy for us, but because people like to garden and to get together and eat well. I come from the principle, I love this quote from Virginia Eubanks. It may resonate with the work that Alpha and Paula were talking about. She talks about creative action and reflection research. And for me, this is something that I take to heart, is that it's also important to create situations where people are both listened to, but also have enjoyment, pleasure, and fun. Conversation is imperative. And part of the point that Eubanks make is that people come to a table, and she speaks specifically about technology and different programs as both knowledgeable and asset-bearing rather than deficient and needy. So we're always asking the question and trying to find ways to value those knowledges and put them into action. We like to flip the question. When we were doing digital work, we were always told to ask this question: what do older adults have to learn from us about living in a digital world? And that's what digital literacy programs tend to be about. But we like to ask the question, what does our aging have to teach us about who we actually live in this digital world and what it means? I want to be provocative for a minute because, and this is something I'm working on and thinking about, and I know there's a lot of health researchers here and I'm going to get in a lot of trouble maybe, but a lot of the models on healthy aging put healthy aging at the center. I want to put empowerment and the older person at the center and and again, think about other forms and ways of not just modeling, but in fact, really thinking about what does it mean to talk about health and well-being in another way, because people that I work with are not motivated by always being asked questions about their health. When I started doing work with older adults, and I said I wanted to do research on and with them about on technology, they automatically assumed I was a health researcher doing work on assistive devices for them. And I said, why? And it's because that's what everybody asks us about. Nobody else asks us about things like how we use cell phones or what we think about communication. So I'm thinking about going back to all of these and thinking about the concept of empowered aging, but specifically the concept of empowerment that comes from the work of Patricia Hill Collins, in particular, her classic work, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment, reissued in 2009 with a much more expanded definition of empowerment that is not just about the individual, but is about the individual in relationship to community with a social justice agenda involved with it. So my question would be, is our goal as researchers, in my case, who work with older adults, to put health at the center and their health at the center, or is it to think first about them and about empowerment, not just agency, because that can be a little bit individualized, but empowerment as trying to address a lifelong process that encompasses the mental, social, physical, and spiritual dimensions of well-being so that people can live the best lives possible as they age, or I should say, as we age, because we're all aging. And the concept of empowered aging is not only about individual well-being, however, it includes as well, what are the resources and infrastructures that need to be put into place to achieve this goal so that it doesn't fall back on individuals and communities to have to find those resources over and over and over again. So I want to move from the idea of knowledge mobilization in the vernacular of current policy parlance and funding agencies to knowledge exchange. Thank you.